Hello and thank you for joining me. Today we're going to be thinking about power and conflict poetry for AQA GCSE English Literature Paper 2, and we're going to be looking at one of the 15 poems from that cluster. Today we're looking at Exposure by Wilfred Owen. The speaker in the poem is Owen himself, so it's his voice. He wrote from personal experience and said his poetry was intended to warn others about the horrors of war. That's a direct quote from Wilfred Owen that you can use in your introduction to the poem if you choose to write about this, or if it's the named poem in the exam. He said his subject was the pity of war, and he fought in World War I and sadly died just before the end of the war, and his mother found out of his death on Armistice Day. So the day that her village was celebrating the end of World War I was also the day that she found out that Owen had lost his life in battle. And since then, his poems have become really iconic and powerful and have been read by people all over the world, and he's considered one of the greatest poets of all time. So we're going to look at Exposure now. This is the poem itself, and it's about his experience of war, and it builds tension and it makes battle seem really distressing. And in this poem, also, nature is a real destructive force. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles. Far off, like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rains soak and clouds sag stormy. Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army attacks one more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. But nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires, glows with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice, the house is theirs. Shutters and doors all closed. On us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever sun smile true on child or field or fruit. For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore not loath, we lie out here. Therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. Tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands and puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party, picks and shovels in shaking grass, pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. Okay, so that's Exposure. It's a really powerful poem, and it's quite a challenging one, but ultimately we need to try and keep it simple today. We need to think about if that poem is the named poem on the exam, or if it's one that we want to use to compare to the named poem, what is it that we need to say? So we need to think firstly about how we're going to structure our response. Now, the first paragraph is where you just explain what your two poems are about, and you need to be quite concise, be clear. It's a couple of sentences about each poem. So here we've got Exposure is a poem by Wilfred Owen and explores his personal experiences of the Great War. He said his subject was the pity of war, and exposure serves to make war seem pitiful and bleak. The poem paints a tragic landscape and explores the inescapable tension that he experienced in dreadful conditions. So here we've got a very quick introduction. Ultimately, it's written by Wilfred Owen. It's about his experiences of war, and he makes war seem dreadful. You need to be able to communicate that very quickly and do the same for your second poem. Your second paragraph is going to talk about the structure in each of the poems. So what you need to do is make a comment on the rhyme scheme or the metre or the lack of a rhyme scheme in each of the poems and explain why that choice might have been made by the writer. So here we've got that model response for you. The structure of Exposure is effective as it serves to unsettle the reader and reflect how tense and distressing the experiences of war are. The last line of each stanza is shorter and also breaks the rhythmic pattern to create tension. So I've explained what structure's been used by Owen and maybe the reason for it. I've linked that to the idea of trying to paint war as a distressing, almost meaningless situation to be in, and it reflects how confusing and chaotic and destructive it is. So that's perhaps the reason for his structural choices. Now, you may have annotated every line of the poem, and if you have done, that's quite fine, but ultimately you've got to think about what you need to do in the exam. You've got 45 minutes. Once you've introduced your poems, you've talked about the structure in them both, you're only going to write about 3 or 4 quotes for each one. That's pretty much the time that you've got to work with. So annotating every line in every stanza for the poem isn't necessarily, I mean, it makes sense to get your head around that poem, but as far as your revision's concerned, revising and learning and revisiting every single line of the poem just isn't a useful thing to do. So here are 4 quotes that you should know for exposure, ready to go in and talk about. So in the top left corner, we've got sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. Now we've got sibilance there. Sibilance just means alliteration. Somebody came up with the word sibilance and said, let's call the s or the sh sounds sibilance, just to sound clever. So you can call it alliteration. You'll get the same mark, but we can also use sibilance if we want to seem a little bit more clever. And the reason for this is it creates a moment of pace in the poem that sort of reflects the idea that war is filled with waiting for your death ultimately, and in this moment there's tension and action, and it's reflected by that use of sibilance that sort of creates tension there and breaks and offers a change of mood. But also you could argue that it sort of reflects the sounds of the gunfire, so it's placing us in that moment and sharing that sort of the tension of that moment with us in that way. We've got the mad gusts tugging on the wire just below. The weather's being personified here to make the situation seem even more terrifying. And you can talk about the idea of like mad, that adjective mad being used there. War is insanity. The idea of it being unnatural, even with this allusion to nature, can be something that you say. Top right, we've got for love of God seems dying. You could say that Owen's questioning whether or not there can be a God, given the horror of this situation. And we've got this refrain, but nothing happens. The last line of each stanza is slightly shorter, which sort of reflects this idea of confusion and creates tension. And that use of but nothing happens reflects the idea that you're constantly waiting for something to happen. So even when in battle, you're not under fire, you're constantly exposed to this real tension and dread and fear. Now that's the exposure for Owen. That's the thing that the soldiers cannot escape from, and it's really destructive. So we'll end here with the assessment objectives. Feel free to pause on these if you want to take them in, and you've got all of the things that you're expected to achieve here for power and conflict poetry. You've got the levels that you can engage with. Feel free to go back, pause that flashcard, copy that out yourself if you want to, or do what you want with it, print it, whatever. But you should have, if you revisit this video, everything you really need for the exam in one place. Remember, there are 15 poems. Your job is to be able to show a really good, confident understanding of the named poem. You'd have that in front of you, and one from your memory. So this is a really good example of how to do that. Revisit the poem, revisit the key moments, and think carefully about the form and structure. Thank you for joining me.